April 8, 1834. A Virginia sheriff lifts a trapdoor no one in the county knew existed, and 47 pairs of eyes, starved, broken, ancient with terror, look up from the dark. They do not scream. They only whisper one word, over and over, like a prayer gone wrong. Mother. Beat of silence. A single iron shackle clanks. This is the story of the woman they called Mother, and the basement where God seemed to have looked away. The frost still clung to the brown grass that morning, glittering like shattered glass under a weak, reluctant sun. Henrico County, Virginia, 1834. A land of red clay, tobacco barns, and slow-moving rivers that carried the smell of wood smoke and distant sin. Most mornings here began with church bells or the lowing of cattle. This morning began with the smell of something wrong. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford rode up the rutted lane toward the Sullivan place with the uneasy feeling men get when they sense the Almighty has already passed judgment and simply hasn't announced it yet. Deputy Marcus Webb rode beside him, younger, quieter, fingers drumming the walnut stock of his rifle the way a man drums a coffin lid. The Sullivan farmhouse rose ahead of them, 2 stories of honest white-clapboard, green shutters, a porch swing swaying though there was no wind. It looked like every other prosperous farm in the county. It looked like Grace. And yet the dogs in the yard would not bark. They only cowered, tails curled beneath their bellies, eyes fixed on the ground as if something beneath the soil might reach up and drag them under. Constant Sullivan met the lawmen at the door exactly as a God-fearing woman should, hands folded, smile gentle, voice soft as lamb's wool. 45 years old, still handsome in the severe way of women who have never needed beauty to get what they wanted. Her black hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin across her cheekbones. Her eyes were the pale gray of winter river ice. "Sheriff Crawford," she greeted, as though she had been expecting him for years. "The Lord's peace be with you this morning." Crawford removed his hat. The polite thing. The necessary thing. But his fingers left damp prints on the brim. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, "we've had complaints. Strange noises. Talk of children crying where no children ought to be. Folks are worried." A flicker, only a flicker, crossed her face. Then the smile returned, warmer now, almost maternal. "Children do cry, Sheriff. Especially the broken ones. My husband and I have taken in so many poor lambs the world threw away. Orphans from Pennsylvania, mostly. Cholera, yellow fever, Indian raids. Grief leaves marks that make them timid around strangers. I'm sure you understand." She stepped aside, ushering them into the keeping room. Sunlight poured through clean windows, glinted off polished pine floors, danced across a sampler on the wall that read, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." The irony would not strike the men for several more minutes. Coffee was offered. Coffee was accepted. The ritual of civility played out while the house around them seemed to listen. It was Deputy Webb who finally broke the spell. "Ma'am, I'll need the privy if it's all the same." Constant Sullivan's eyes flicked toward the back door, only for an instant, then returned to the sheriff, serene. "Of course, Deputy." Out back, past the smokehouse. Webb stepped onto the porch. The morning was silent except for the soft creak of the swing and the far-off scream of a hawk. He rounded the corner of the house, boots crunching on frost-bitten grass, and that was when he saw it. A slanted cellar door set into the foundation, oak planks bound with iron, secured by not 1, not 2, but 3 heavy padlocks the size of a man's fist. Fresh scratches marred the wood around the hasp, as though fingernails had clawed for purchase. And from beneath, faint, so faint he thought he imagined it, came the sound of breathing. Many lungs. Small lungs. Moving in and out together like a single terrified animal. Webb's hand went to the revolver at his belt. He turned back toward the house and shouted one word that shattered the morning like gunfire. "Crawford." Inside, the coffee cup in Constant Sullivan's hand did not tremble. It simply stopped halfway to her lips, suspended, as though time itself had paused to watch what came next. But we are not there yet. To understand how the darkness beneath that house grew so vast it could swallow 47 childhoods, we must go back across 2 decades of lies so patient, so lovingly tended, they grew to look exactly like charity. Ezra Sullivan, tall, quiet, heir to a modest tobacco fortune, purchased 200 acres of rolling Henrico land with cash money and a surveyor's eye. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and already spoken of in Richmond as particular. Men said he read too much. Women said he stared too long. He built the house himself, plank by plank, with the help of hired laborers who remembered him as generous but strange. He paid in gold coin. He never allowed any man to see more than his own small section of the work, especially the cellar. While most Virginia homes had simple root cellars, low, damp rooms for apples and salt pork, Ezra's plans called for something else. He dug deep. He dug wide. He braced the walls with thick oak beams shipped down from Philadelphia. He installed iron rings into those beams at regular intervals, the way a man might install coat hooks in a hallway. When the local carpenter, Josiah Reed, asked what the rings were for, Ezra smiled the small, private smile of a man keeping courtship with a secret. "For storage," he said. "Just storage." In 1811 Ezra returned from a trip north with a bride, Constant Mercy Albright, 22, daughter of a failed Pennsylvania preacher. She was pale, black-haired, soft-spoken, and already, though no one in Millbrook could have known it, pregnant with something that was not a child. The wedding was small. The congregation of Millbrook Methodist praised the match. Here, they said, was a godly couple who would do good works. And for a time they did. Constant taught Sunday school. She brought baskets to the sick. She spoke in a voice so gentle it seemed the Holy Spirit himself leaned in to listen. But there were oddities. Travelers who spent the night spoke of hearing muffled crying beneath the floorboards. Ezra always explained it away. Wind in the chimney, a barn cat with kittens, the restless dreams of traumatized orphans. And the orphans began to appear. First 1 or 2, then 4, then 7. No one in Millbrook ever saw them clearly. A small face at an upper window. A child's shadow flitting across the yard at dusk. When neighbors asked to meet the children, Constance's eyes would fill with tears, real tears, brimming and perfect. "They're so frightened," she would whisper. "Their parents died horribly. Some were beaten. Some were used. They hide when strangers come. But in time, with prayer, they'll heal." And because this was 1815, and orphan trains had not yet been invented, and because childhood itself was still half wild and disposable, the community nodded. They looked away. They praised the Sullivans' Christian selflessness. They never saw the wagon that arrived under cover of night, canvas sides laced tight, driven by men who would not meet your eyes. They never saw the children unloaded, gagged, bound, drugged with laudanum, carried one by one through the slanted cellar door while Constance Sullivan stood above them in her white nightgown, candle in hand, murmuring the same phrase again and again like a benediction. "Hush now, little lambs. Mother is here." Down the wooden steps, past the barrels of cornmeal and salt pork that were only theater, into the real cellar. Imagine it. A cavernous room lit by a single tallow candle that threw shadows like demons on the walls. 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, 8 feet high. Earthen floor packed hard by the tread of bare, bleeding feet. Iron rings bolted to the beams. Chains, short, heavy, rusted, running from those rings to iron cuffs around thin ankles. 47 children by 1834. Ages 6 to 16. Some had been there 10 years. Some had never seen daylight except through a crack in the floorboards above. They were not beaten often. Beating leaves marks, and marks raise questions. Instead they were starved just enough, drugged just enough, whispered to just enough that the world above became a dream and Mother Sullivan became God. She fed them herself, thin cornmeal gruel ladled from a wooden bucket while she stroked their hair and recited scripture. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." She bathed them in icy water drawn from the well at midnight, scrubbing their skin with lye soap until it bled, telling them it was to wash away the sins of their old lives. She named them after the virtues she claimed they lacked: patience, obedience, silence, chastity. And at night she read to them from a Bible whose margins were filled with her own cramped handwriting, verses about the wrath of God, the punishment of the wicked, the eternal furnace prepared for those who disobeyed mother. Some children tried to escape. One boy, 14, red-haired, taken from a Baltimore dock, managed to pick the lock on his ankle cuff with a nail he'd hidden for 2 years. He made it as far as the top step. They found his body 3 days later hanging from the same iron ring, tongue black, eyes wide, a single word carved into his chest with a table knife. Mother. After that, no one tried again. The years rolled on. Presidents changed. Cotton boomed. Slavery debates grew heated in Richmond drawing rooms while, 30 miles away, white children, because that was the final, exquisite horror, white children wasted away in chains beneath a Christian woman's floorboards. And no one knew. Until the winter of 1834, when the cold reached down into hell itself and refused to let go. February. The James River froze solid. Cattle died standing up. And beneath the Sullivan house, the children began to die too. Not from cold. Constant kept braziers burning day and night, the smoke vented through hidden flues so no one would see. They died from the cough. From infected sores that would not heal. From pure despair. 3 small bodies were carried out under moonlight and buried in unmarked graves behind the barn. Constant wept over them, real tears again, while Ezra shoveled frozen dirt and quoted Revelation about the pale horse. That was when the noises began to escape. First the traveler, Jacob Stern, snowbound and uneasy, hearing muffled crying he was told was the wind. Then Mary Catherine Flynn, 19, Irish, freckled, trusting, knocking at the door in a storm and never leaving. And finally William Hutchinson the rabbit hunter, crouched behind oaks, watching Ezra Sullivan emerge from the cellar at dusk carrying something wrapped in burlap that left a trail of blood across the frost. By the time Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb stood in Constant Sullivan's keeping room on the morning of April 8, 1834, the machinery of divine justice had already begun to turn. The coffee had gone cold. Constant was still speaking, something about letters from Pennsylvania, something about patience, when Webb's shout split the air. Crawford's chair scraped back. His revolver cleared leather with a speed that surprised even him. He crossed the room in 3 strides, seized Constant Sullivan by the arm, her bones felt like a bird's beneath the sleeve, and propelled her ahead of him through the door, out into the blinding April light. "Keys," he said. Her face had changed. The mask of gentle motherhood was gone. What remained was something older. Something that had waited a very long time. "Keys," Crawford repeated, pressing the barrel of his pistol beneath her chin. For a moment she only looked at him, gray eyes unblinking, ancient. Then she smiled. And from beneath the house came the sound of chains, 47 sets of chains, beginning to rattle all at once, like the applause of the damned. The first padlock gave with a brittle metallic sigh. The second fought, rusted, stubborn, as though it knew what waited below. The third snapped so violently the hasp tore half the iron hinge from the oak. Then the doors were thrown back. A visible wave of stench rolled up the slant and struck the 4 men like a fist. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford staggered. Deputy Marcus Webb dropped to his knees and retched into the frostbitten grass. The 2 neighbors who had ridden out to witness, William Hutchinson and Old Man Reed, simply stood frozen, mouths open, as if the air itself had turned to stone. It was not the smell of a root cellar. It was the smell of every childhood prayer that had gone unanswered, distilled into vapor. Crawford drew his lantern high. The weak circle of light slid down rough-hewn steps that disappeared into blackness so complete it seemed to drink the flame. From that blackness rose a sound none of them would ever forget. A low, collective whimper, dozens of throats trying not to hope, because hope had been beaten out of them years ago. Crawford's voice cracked when he spoke. "Children," he called, the word trembling. "This is the law. You're safe now." There was no answer. Only the soft, continuous clink of iron on iron as 47 small bodies shifted in their chains. Constant Sullivan stood 10 feet behind them, hands folded, head slightly bowed, the perfect picture of pious resignation. Only the pulse beating visibly in her throat betrayed her. "Sheriff," she said, soft as communion wine, "you're making a terrible mistake." Crawford did not look back. He was already descending. The steps were narrow, slick with something that gleamed wet in the lantern light. At the bottom the passage turned sharply left, forcing the men to duck beneath a low beam. Then the cellar opened up. And language failed. Imagine a cathedral built for suffering. The main chamber stretched 60 feet beneath the innocent kitchen above. Stone walls wept moisture. Thick oak posts marched in 2 rows like the columns of some infernal church. From each post, chains, short, brutal, hand-forged, ran to the floor where they ended in iron cuffs locked around the ankles of children. 47 of them. Some sat. Some lay curled on their sides. Some stood because sitting had become too painful on open sores. Their ages, later counted precisely, ranged from 6-year-old Mary Doyle, taken from a Baltimore poorhouse in 1829, to 16-year-old Elias Hart, who had once been a cabin boy on a Chesapeake schooner. Their eyes were the worst. Not wild. Not pleading. Just empty. Eyes that had watched every door of the world slam shut. Rags barely clung to their bodies. Remnants of dresses and shirts Constant had bought by the bolt in Richmond and cut down into shapeless garments that would never be seen by the outside world. Skin stretched over bone like wet parchment. Sores ringed every ankle where iron had worn through to the tendon. Many coughed in wet, rattling bursts that sounded like death clearing its throat. No one spoke. They had been taught that speaking brought darkness. Crawford's lantern moved across them slowly, as if the light itself feared what it might reveal. When it reached the far wall, the sheriff saw the smallest child, a girl no more than 7, trying to shrink behind an older boy. She was clutching something in her skeletal fingers. It was a crudely carved wooden doll no longer than a man's thumb. Across its belly, someone had scratched a single word with a nail. Mother. Deputy Webb made it 10 steps in before he broke. He dropped the shotgun, fell against the damp wall, and sobbed like a child himself, raw, tearing sounds that echoed off stone and made the chained children flinch in perfect unison. Crawford could not move. He simply stood in the middle of that underground nave and felt the full weight of 20 years of human evil settle on his shoulders like a cloak woven from children's screams. Then he noticed the side passages. 3 doorways, low and black, branched off the main chamber like the arms of a cross inverted. He forced himself forward. The first room was punishment. A set of wooden stocks, child-sized. A whipping post still dark with old blood. A single iron cage barely large enough for a 10-year-old to crouch inside. On the wall hung a leather strap and a bundle of willow switches, neatly tied with twine the way a farmer ties kindling. The second room was medical, but not merciful. A rough plank table stained almost black. Rusty surgical tools laid out in perfect rows. Jars of salve. Bottles labeled laudanum, calomel, oil of vitriol. And a ledger, thick, leather-bound, its pages filled with Constant Sullivan's precise, beautiful handwriting. Crawford opened it with shaking hands. Names. Dates of acquisition. Prices paid. Notes on temperament. Patience, 8 years, Irish, compliant after 3 days' darkness, $75. Obedience, 12 years, runaway from Maryland, strong back, will fetch more later, $180. Silence, 6 years, German tongue, removed same, now perfect. At the bottom of one page, in red ink, remember Proverbs 13 verse 24. He that spareth the rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. The third passage was the worst. To reach it the men had to crawl on hands and knees through a tunnel no wider than a coffin. The air here was colder, thicker, sweet in the way only death is sweet. At the end lay a chamber no larger than a rich man's parlor, and beneath its packed earth floor, 36 small graves. Some were no more than shallow depressions outlined with lime. Others had been dug up recently, the dirt still soft. Tiny rib cages poked through like the bars of broken bird cages. Skulls no bigger than teacups stared up at the lantern with black, forgiving sockets. Crawford counted them twice. 36. Added to the 47 still breathing above, that made 83 children who had entered this house and never left it as anything resembling human. One grave held something that made even the hardened sheriff cry out. A child, couldn't tell boy or girl anymore, had been buried face down, arms twisted behind the back, still wearing the iron cuffs. Across the tiny shoulder blades someone had carved, deep enough to reach bone, a single word. Ungrateful. That was when Crawford understood. This was not mere cruelty. This was worship. Constant Sullivan had built a church beneath her kitchen floor, and the sacrament was absolute ownership of the soul. Back in the main chamber, the children had begun to move. Slowly, painfully, they were inching forward on their chains, not toward the light, but toward Constant Sullivan. She had descended the steps while the men were in the burial room. She stood now at the foot of the stairs in her plain gray dress, hands clasped, face radiant with something that looked almost like love. "My lambs," she crooned, voice soft, musical, the same voice that had read them Bible verses while they starved. "Come to Mother." And they came. Dozens of skeletal forms dragging chains across stone, reaching out with fingers that ended in broken nails, faces upturned toward her like flowers toward a killing sun. One boy, 15, maybe 16, eyes milk-white with cataracts, knelt at her feet and pressed his forehead to her shoe. "Forgive us, Mother," he whispered, voice rusted from disuse. "We were loud. We'll be quiet now. Please don't put us back in the dark." Constant Sullivan laid her hand on his filthy hair the way the Virgin lays her hand on the Christ child in paintings. "Sure," she said. "Mother forgives." In that moment Sheriff Crawford understood something that would haunt him every remaining day of his life. Some of the children still loved her. They loved her the way the Israelites loved the golden calf, because she was the only God they had ever been allowed to see. He raised his pistol. "Constant Mercy Sullivan," he said, voice shaking with rage and something darker, something that felt like awe, "you are under arrest for the false imprisonment, enslavement, and murder of these children and of God alone knows how many more." She turned then, and for the first time the mask slipped entirely. Her face was not angry. It was pitying. "You think you're saving them, Sheriff?" she asked gently. "Look at them. They have no families, no names, no place in the world above. I gave them purpose. I gave them mother. Out there they would have starved in gutters or been worked to death in factories. Here they belong to someone. Here they are loved." She spread her arms, and half a dozen children flinched toward her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. Crawford's finger whitened on the trigger. Behind him, Deputy Webb whispered a broken prayer. And somewhere in the dark, a chain rattled like the laughter of something that had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. The reckoning had only just begun. Richmond, Virginia. Late summer, 1834. The city smelled of tar, horse dung, and panic. Federal marshals rode in at dawn, 24 strong, boots black with the dust of 5 states. They carried warrants sealed with federal wax and expressions that suggested they had already seen hell and were now looking for its architects. At the center of the storm stood a girl. Rebecca King, 14 years old, 94 pounds of bone and memory, sat on a plain wooden chair in the governor's mansion, wrapped in a quilt that still smelled of the Sullivan basement. Her eyes were too old for her face. When she spoke, grown men looked away. She had asked for a map. They gave her one that stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. With a finger that still bore the half-moon scar of an iron cuff, she began to mark the places she had heard whispered in the dark. A cross outside Philadelphia. Another near Baltimore. 3 in the Carolina Lowcountry. 1 deep in the Georgia Pine Barrens. Each cross was a farm. Each farm was a basement. Each basement was a grave. Rebecca spoke for 6 hours without once raising her voice. She recited names, dates, carriage descriptions, the exact price paid for a 9-year-old boy with good teeth and quiet manners. She recited the sound a child makes when the laudanum wears off and the chains bite again. When she finished, the Attorney General of the United States closed the map with shaking hands and said the sentence that would damn a generation. "My God, it's a second slave trade. Only this time the cargo is white, and the buyers are us." The network had a name among its members, never written, only whispered. The Ledger. A loose alliance of respectable monsters who discovered that poor white children, orphans, runaways, the offspring of drunkards and debtors, were easier to disappear than any enslaved person ever could be. No bills of sale on public record. No abolitionists watching the docks. No families with the money or the will to search. Just cash, silence, and the promise that no one would ever ask where the new servants came from. Constant Sullivan had been one of the chief suppliers. But she was never the queen. The queen was already dead, hanged by her own hand, or so the official report read, in the Richmond jail on the morning she was scheduled to name every buyer from Boston to New Orleans. They found her swinging from a strip torn from her petticoat, neck broken, face serene. On the wall of her cell, scratched with a smuggled nail, were 3 words. The Ledger Lives. That same week, a 12-year-old boy named Timothy, who had begun to remember his real surname and the sound of his mother's voice, vanished from the church orphanage where the survivors were kept. His cot was still warm. The window latch had been cut from the outside with a blade no child could reach. The message was written on the pillow in charcoal. 1 lamb strays, the whole flock burns. After that, the children slept with marshals at their doors and loaded rifles under their beds. But fear could not stop what had already begun rolling downhill. Samuel Pierce arrived in Richmond on a rain-soaked night in September, riding a mule half dead from the journey. 43 years old, sunburned to leather, hands that trembled only when he tried to forget. He had been Henry Blackwood's overseer for 11 years. He carried a carpet-bag that clinked when he walked. Inside were ledgers bound in black oilcloth, each page a scream written in neat copperplate. He asked for the federal prosecutor by name. He would speak to no one else. They gave him a room with barred windows and 2 guards who never slept. Then he began to talk. And hell opened its account books. The Blackwood plantation lay 20 miles outside Charleston, a white-columned empire built on cotton and something far worse. To the world it was a model of southern refinement. Magnolia trees, carriage drives, a master with degrees from Edinburgh and Paris. Behind a screen of loblolly pines lay a second plantation no visitor ever saw. They called it the Quarters. A stockade of yellow pine. No windows. 1 gate. Inside, 40 small cells, a surgical theater with drains in the floor, and a furnace that burned day and night. Samuel Pierce had the keys for 8 years. He described the arrival of a shipment in the spring of 1831. 6 children from the Sullivan farm, ages 7 to 13, delivered before dawn in a closed wagon that smelled of vomit and fear. Henry Blackwood inspected them by lamplight the way a man inspects horses, idly, lifting lips to check teeth, pinching arms, asking each child to walk, jump, hold still while he pressed a thumb into the soft spot beneath the jaw. 2 were chosen immediately for the house. The other 4 were led to the quarters. There they were stripped, shaved, numbered with a branding iron on the left shoulder blade, HB in flowing script, and entered into the black ledgers. Then the experiments began. Pierce read from the pages in a voice that never rose, never broke, as though he were reciting the weather. Entry dated May 14, 1831. Subject number 117. Male. Approximate. 10 years. Irish. Delivered Sullivan lot. Day 1. Baseline vitals. Day 3. Introduction of experimental calomel dosage. 30 grains. Day 7. Gums bleeding. Hair loss noted. Day 12. Subject begs for mother. Day 15. Deceased. Kidneys black. Buried row 3 plot 9. Another page. Subject number 129. Female. 12 years. Strong. Purchased premium. Purpose. Endurance trial. Cotton picking 18 hours. No water above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Day 4. Feet raw. Begs to return to chains. Day 6. Attempted escape. Hamstring tendons severed per protocol. Day 21. Sold to Dr. M. for vivisection study, $400. There were hundreds of such entries. Some children lasted months. Most lasted weeks. A few, pretty ones, quiet ones, were cleaned up, dressed in livery, and sent to fine houses in Charleston, Savannah, Mobile. They learned quickly never to speak of where they had been. The ones who did were returned to the furnace. Pierce saved the worst for last. Every autumn, Henry Blackwood hosted what he called the exhibition. An invitation-only affair. Carriages arrived after midnight, curtains drawn. Inside the quarters the children were arranged like produce, washed, hair combed, dressed in clean Osnaburg shifts. Lanterns on hooks cast golden light that made the bruises look almost like shadows. Buyers walked the aisles with brandy glasses in hand. They asked questions the way men ask about breeding stock. Does this one flinch when struck? How long under water before unconsciousness? Any history of screaming during procedures? Orders were taken. A 9-year-old boy with blonde curls fetched $750, destined for a New Orleans gentleman with particular tastes. A pair of 12-year-old twins went for $1,100 to a Louisiana sugar planter who needed subjects for the new breaking method. The evening ended with a demonstration. A child, usually one who had become troublesome, was brought to the center of the room. Blackwood would lecture on the latest theories of pain compliance, fear conditioning, the breaking of the human spirit. Then he would illustrate. Pierce refused to describe the final demonstration of 1833. He simply slid a folded sheet across the table. On it was a single line in Blackwood's elegant hand. Subject screamed for mother until the vocal cords ruptured. Most satisfactory. When Pierce finished, the prosecutor was weeping silently into his handkerchief. The court reporter had fainted across her desk. The raids began 48 hours later. October 17, 1834. A day remembered in federal annals as Black Thursday. At dawn, 200 marshals and local deputies struck 12 locations simultaneously. A warehouse on the Baltimore docks. A respectable orphanage in Philadelphia that was not an orphanage at all. 3 plantations along the Ashley River. A doctor's mansion in Savannah whose basement held operating tables and jars no medical school would claim. A cotton farm in Georgia where the field hands were all under 14 and answered to numbers. They found 119 children. Some were found in cages. Some floated face down in horse troughs, wrists still bound. Some had been buried alive when the alarm came, dirt still under their fingernails when they clawed their way back out. They found furnaces still warm. They found ledgers that cross-referenced with Constant Sullivan's own. They found a map, Rebecca's map, now bleeding red with new pins. And in Henry Blackwood's personal study they found the crown jewel. A leather-bound volume titled in gold leaf, The Ledger, Volume 4. 1830 to 1834. Inside were 642 names. Less than half were marked, still breathing. The rest were annotated with dates of death and disposal instructions. At the very back, in fresh ink, was a single unsigned entry dated 2 days after Constant Sullivan's suicide. Virginia operation compromised. Burn the cellars. Scatter the lambs. The trade continues. Blackwood himself was not at home when the marshals arrived. He was discovered 3 days later in the Charleston harbor, floating beneath the wharf with his throat cut so deeply the head was attached by gristle alone. In his pocket was a note in the same hand as the final ledger entry. Better the devil you know. The trials that followed were a national wound. Juries wept openly. Newspapers printed black borders around their front pages for weeks. 23 men of property and standing were convicted. 7 hanged in public squares while crowds watched in perfect silence. No cheers, no jeers, only the sound of thousands realizing what their country had allowed to grow in its cellar. But most of the buyers, men with softer hands and harder lawyers, walked free. Evidence vanished. Witnesses recanted. One federal judge was found shot in his chambers the night before he was to deliver a key ruling. By 1836, the great exposé had become a footnote, then a rumor, then the kind of story mothers told children to make them behave. The surviving children, those strong enough, sane enough, were scattered to orphanages, churches, distant relatives who preferred not to ask questions. Rebecca King refused every offer. She took the name Rebecca Sullivan, no relation, she said with a bitter smile, and disappeared west with a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned inside her coat and a list of names burned into her memory. Some say she hunted the remnants of the ledger for the rest of her life. Some say she found them. In the end, the Sullivan farm itself delivered the final judgment. In 1841 lightning struck the abandoned house. The fire burned for 3 days, hot enough to melt the iron rings in the basement walls. When it was over, nothing remained but scorched earth and a depression in the ground shaped like a grave no one had ever filled. Travelers passing years later claimed that on certain April nights, when the air turns cold and the dogs refuse to bark, you can still hear it. 47 sets of chains, dragging slowly across stone that is no longer there. And a woman's voice, soft as communion wine, calling her children home. November 15, 1836. Richmond, Virginia. The sky was the color of old pewter the morning they hanged Ezra Sullivan. 3,000 people stood in silence beneath it. No jeers, no cheers, only the slow creak of the gallows rope and the sound of 1,000 held breaths. Ezra's neck snapped clean. His body jerked once, twice, then hung still. A single scrap of paper fluttered from his pocket and landed face up in the frost. On it, in his own cramped hand, "I was only the carpenter. She was the cathedral." They cut him down at sunset and buried him in unhallowed ground beyond the almshouse wall. No marque, no prayer. Just a shallow hole and the quiet satisfaction that one more devil had been sent below to keep the furnace hot. But the furnace was already cold. Constant had cheated the rope months earlier, swinging from her petticoat in that Richmond cell, eyes wide, smiling like a bride. Henry Blackwood followed in 1841, found dead on his prison cot, lips blue, a look of mild surprise frozen on his patrician face. Poison, most said. Silence purchased with a vial. Of the 23 men convicted, only 9 ever felt the trapdoor fall. The rest, judges, planters, physicians, even a United States Senator from South Carolina, walked free on technicalities, bribes, or the simple, ancient magic of being too important to hang. Justice, it turned out, was a child's story. The real punishment was quieter, and it never ended. 1845. The Sullivan Farm. The house had stood empty for 11 years, windows blind, porch sagging like a broken jaw. On the first warm day of spring, a federal crew arrived with sledgehammers and barrels of concrete. They tore the farmhouse down plank by plank. They collapsed the barn. They smashed the iron rings from the basement walls and carried them away in wagons, as if removing the hardware could remove the sin. Then they poured 2 feet of wet concrete over the place where 47 children once lay chained. When it hardened, they seeded grass and erected a small stone at the edge of the field. It read only, "In memory of the unknown." 1834. No names. Most of the dead never had them to begin with. Travelers avoided the road after dark. Dogs refused to cross the property. On certain nights in April, wagon drivers swore they heard the slow scrape of iron across stone, though the stone was buried beneath earth and concrete and 11 years of Virginia rain. The children who lived scattered like seeds blown by a cruel wind. Some were taken in by Quaker families in Pennsylvania, quiet homes with soft voices and warm bread. Some were claimed by distant cousins who wanted the government stipend more than the child. A few, too broken, too strange, were locked away in the new asylums springing up across the north, places with names like House of Refuge that smelled of lie and despair. Rebecca King, once Rebecca of the Iron Cuffs, now just Rebecca, married a blacksmith in Lancaster County in 1849. She bore 6 children, all with her dark hair and watchful eyes. She taught them to read from the same Bible Constant Sullivan had once used as a weapon. When they asked why she sometimes woke screaming, she only said, "Because some prayers are answered too late." She died in 1893 at the age of 73, peaceful in her sleep. In her hand they found a tiny wooden doll no longer than a thumb, belly scratched with a single word, "Mother." They buried it with her. Of the others, the stories are harder. Elias Hart, the cabin boy with the milk-white eyes, hanged himself in a Baltimore boarding house in 1842. In his pocket was a note, "The dark is kinder." Mary Doyle, the smallest, lived to 40 but never spoke again after the rescue. She rocked on porches and hummed the lullaby Constant used to sing while ladling out watery gruel. One boy, nobody ever learned his real name, was adopted by Sheriff Crawford himself. He grew tall, became a preacher, and thundered from pulpits about the wages of sin until his voice gave out in 1881. On his deathbed he confessed to Crawford's son that every night he still felt the cuff around his ankle and woke reaching for a mother who was not his mother. The reforms came, of course. Virginia passed the Children's Protection Act of 1838, the first in the nation, requiring licenses for anyone housing more than 3 unrelated minors, mandating inspections, creating the office of county guardian. Other states followed. Federal marshals received broader powers to cross state lines in pursuit of traffickers in human flesh. Orphanages were stormed and cleaned out. Some closed forever. Some were reborn under stricter eyes. But the ledgers never stopped burning. In attics, in bank vaults, in the private studies of men who summered in Europe, the black books of the ledger were fed to fires one careful page at a time. Names vanished. Fortunes were laundered into railroads, cotton, sugar, respectability. By 1850 most Americans had never heard of Constant Sullivan. By 1860 the story was a ghost tale told to misbehaving children. Be good, or Mother Sullivan will come and chain you in her cellar. The war came. Fields that once grew tobacco grew blood instead. And in the chaos of emancipation, the old trade simply changed color. New victims, same silence. Yet something did change. A generation of lawyers, doctors, magistrates, and ordinary citizens carried the memory like a scar. They looked harder at locked doors. They asked questions when too many children disappeared from too many poorhouses. They wrote laws with teeth. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, promoted to U.S. Marshal, hunted the remnants until he died of fever in 1857, still carrying Rebecca's map in his saddlebag, edges soft from 20 years of handling. His last words, according to the deputy at his side, "Keep listening for the chains." Dr. Marcus Whitfield spent the rest of his life running a free clinic in Richmond for street children. He never charged a penny. Every patient received a warm meal and the same question. "Who loves you, child?" If the answer was no one, he kept them until someone did. And in the end, perhaps that was the only victory possible. Not that evil was destroyed. Evil is patient, and America is vast, but that a handful of children lived long enough to tell, and a handful of adults listened hard enough to pass the warning down. The concrete over the Sullivan basement cracked in the earthquake of 1886. Grass grew through it. Then redbud trees. Then silence again. But silence is never empty. Walk that field today, now a quiet pasture outside a town that changed its name twice to escape its past, and you can still see the faint depression where the house once stood. On certain April evenings, when the wind moves south to north and the moon is thin as a blade, old folks say you can hear it. A soft voice, maternal, almost tender, drifting up through roots and concrete and 190 years of soil. 47 small answers rise to meet it. Faint, rusted, eternal. Yes. Mother. We're here. We never left. And somewhere, in the dark beneath every nation that believes itself civilized, the chains begin to move again. Because the basement is never really filled. Only forgotten. Until someone starts digging. Final screen, black background, white text fading in slowly. The real events described in this series are drawn from suppressed records, private family papers, and court documents that were sealed for 150 years. Some names have been changed. Some horrors have not. If you carry children in your life, look harder. Listen closer. Never trust the smile that asks for privacy with someone else's child. The chains are still down there. And Mother is still counting.